Thank you all for joining tonight's forum titled A New Vision for Open Space. My name is Adam Ganser, and I'm the Executive Director of New Yorkers for Parks. New Yorkers for Parks is a 100-year-old not-for-profit that champions equitable access to quality parks and open space throughout the city. We do this through research, advocacy, and public programming. We invite you to learn more about our work at our website, www.ny4p.org. Tonight, we'll be hearing from the leading candidates for council speaker on a collection of issues all relating to the future of New York City's parks, open spaces, streets, sidewalks, and beyond. On January 1, our city will have a new mayor in office. We'll also have a new city council with its own agenda for the future of New York. The last 18 months have demonstrated how important these spaces are and how much more we need to do to support them. As a city, we need a policy agenda that prioritizes public open spaces from our streets to our parks to the community spaces we use every day. These places play a clear role in our public health, safety and quality of life, economic recovery, and climate resilience, and they should be drivers for a more equitable New York City. New Yorkers for Parks is proud to partner with organizations that are also leaders when it comes to these conversations. We thank the New York League of Conservation Voters, the Regional Plan Association, and the Center for an Urban Future. Guiding tonight's conversation is Katie Honan. Katie is a reporter for the city who has covered City Hall for the Wall Street Journal, but has also reported on communities on the ground and across the boroughs for various outlets. Thank you, Katie, for joining us tonight as moderator, and I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Adam, and thanks to everyone for tuning in to this conversation tonight. I'm excited to be here because this is such an important moment for our city. As Adam mentioned, we'll have a new mayor in office in January, but we'll also have a new city council that's more diverse than ever and represents a lot more of the city than ever before. And tonight we are joined by some of the elected officials from across the city who want to share their vision for open space and how they would lead a city council as speaker, committed to supporting and improving the public realm. So I'm excited to welcome, and this is in alphabetical order before anyone wonders why, Councilmember Justin Brannan of Brooklyn's 43rd District, outgoing Manhattan Borough President and incoming council member for the 6th District in Manhattan, Gale Brewer, Councilmember Francisco Moya of the 21st District in Queens, Councilmember Keith Powers of Manhattan's 4th District, and Councilmember Carlina Rivera of Manhattan's 2nd District. I just want to note that council members Adrienne and Diana Ayala were both unable to join, but they send their regards. And we do think it's important to share each council member's responses to tonight's questions on these important policies. And we are coordinating to be able to share their responses to tonight's questions following the forum alongside all the candidates on tonight's panel. So just keep an eye on New Yorkers for Parks website for more on that soon. And we also want to acknowledge, just for a programming note, that Ms. Brewer will need to step off for a few minutes at 7 p.m., but will rejoin us. So thank you all for taking the time to be a part of tonight's panel. And it's safe to assume that most of the viewers here who want to hear from these speaker candidates tonight know exactly what a speaker is. But just to refresh everyone's memories, the speaker is the person who sets the agenda and leads the city council's legislative priorities. Unlike a mayor or a comptroller or the public advocate or the council members themselves, the speaker is chosen not by city voters, but by members of the council who represent the city's 51 districts across the city. The council will vote for the new speaker in January once the council is seated. But obviously this council speaker has, whoever it is, there are a lot of ramifications for the more than 8 million people here in New York City. And as I said earlier, this council will be a different council than the one that is leaving. A new speaker will lead a body that added a historic number of women to its ranks, doubling the number of women in the council. And it'll be one of the most diverse in the council's history, with 35 members identifying as people of color. This new council and speaker will be diving into the work almost immediately. Within the first month, the Adams administration will lay out its preliminary budget with its priorities for the city. So whoever ends up being selected by their peers in the council will need to help lay out this new council's response and its own priorities. So on that note, we will dive into the first question. And just so you know, we have randomly selected tonight's order of speakers. So we will start with Ms. Brewer, followed by Mr. Brannan, Mr. Moya, Ms. Rivera, Mr. Powers, and Mr. Powers. So, we wanted to get into 3 general themes, and it's how we fund our open spaces, how we manage our open spaces, and how we make our shared infrastructure more resilient. And just to get into the format also for you all, it's 90 minutes. We're going to be out and on hard out. There is the council, you have 60 seconds to answer each question. You won't make opening remarks, you'll make closing remarks. And if someone mentions another candidate, you have 20 seconds to respond. And each candidate should get at least one question directed at them. That's for us. But so we will ask the first question. New York City's parks have been underfunded and under-resourced for decades, with funding frequently being cut. Most cities commit 1% to 4% of their city budget to parks. Do you support the 1% for New York City Parks pledge as Mayor-elect Adams has? And as a follow-up, how will you ensure that parks funding isn't cut in the future if there's a financial crisis like we saw during the pandemic?
Oh, the answer to your question is absolutely. And I think all of my colleagues will probably feel very strongly about the 1%. It's just something that this organization and others have been calling for forever. So absolutely 1%. And I think if we could do more, we would. You have to baseline it. And that's what I would suggest, because parks right now often do not have enough horticulturalists. They also have the other problem, which comes into the capital side, because you're talking about expense for the 1%, is that god-awful procurement process. I mean, I am somebody for 8 years and then 12 years, tried to get parks projects done. And I can tell you, not only are they challenged 2, 3, 5 years, but let me give an example. Recently, Colonel Young, which is in Harlem, we finally got some private money. It was going to be $5 million with private money and $11 million if we'd done it 100% with city money. So it's a question of not only getting the 1% to 4%, I wouldn't even mind going higher than what others have suggested, but redoing, finding out how in the world to make this procurement process go less expensively and faster in terms of the Parks Department, because a bathroom is $1 million at least, and et cetera. So I would just say, yes, we need the money. We have to figure out the procurement process. We've got to have more people, 42 million people in Central Park. And God, that's the largest. They all are packed. They need that maintenance and they need procurement fixed.
Great, thank you. Mr. Brannan?
Yeah, I often walk my dogs through the park, and it makes me think of those who came before us who had the foresight to carve out these sprawling urban oases and to conserve the wilderness and the nature inside this crazy vertical city. And like Gale said, I mean, we've had decades and decades of mayors being just cavalier about gutting the Parks Department budget. And dedicating just 1% of the city's budget to parks would bring us closer to the more generous funding levels of the past. But I think that's just a starting point. I think we've got to do much better. I think during COVID, people really built a new relationship with their parks and their playgrounds. I mean, I had, one of the main parks in my district where during the height of COVID, where people were outside overhearing people saying, this was the first time that they had been to this park, which is, these are parks that I grew up in. So hearing that people, this is the first time they had been there was wild. But I think people are really appreciating open space more. And I think we need to take this moment to make sure that we're truly doubling down on our investments in the Parks Department, especially in parks and playgrounds that have been just woefully underfunded for decades and decades. And then I'll end on the procurement process. As the former chair of the Contracts Committee, the procurement is really the inequity hidden in plain sight. I mean, it is just criminal how much this stuff costs, how long it takes. I usually tell parents in my district that I'm hopeful that a playground that I've allocated money to will be finished by the time their kid gets into Yale. And I'm only half joking. And it really shouldn't be that way. So I think dedicating just at least 1% of the city's budget to Parks Department is a must, is a starting point, but we really have to drill down on procurement reform.
Thank you. Mr. Moya?
Thank you. Thank you, Katie. Look, I grew up I live 4 blocks from Flushing Meadows Corona Park. It's where my father met my mother during the World's Fair. It's where I learned to play soccer. And it was where the community was able to really enjoy that beautiful park that we have during COVID. To me, I fully support committing to the 1% of the city's budget to parks. But funding at 1% needs to be the floor, not the ceiling of how we go about, doing our expense budget for parks. These are New York City treasures that all New Yorkers from every background are able to enjoy, and we need to treat we need to treat parks as critical city services, just like we do with teachers and firefighters, because we have to view parks as being essential services, because we have to ensure that the funding is not cut in the future. These are the things that really helped our community in the last 18 months. We can talk about the capital side of things in terms of the procurement process in a separate note, but this is what we really need to start building our foundation on when we want to talk about how we can take care of the future of our parks. It's the second largest park in the city of New York, Flushing Meadows Corona Park. You go there on any given day of the week, and if there's a patch of grass there, someone's playing soccer, people are enjoying their parks, and what we need to do is make real investments in maintaining our parks for this great city that we live in.
Thank you. I presume you mean the 64 or 65 World's Fair, not 39 right now.
How old do I look to you, Katie?
Just kidding. It's an old World's Fair joke. Next up, we have Ms. Rivera.
Like Katie with the Queen's knowledge always. Yes, I will commit to at least 1% of the budget going to the Parks Department. No brainer. I think public investment in our parks is essential. Without it, our parks are only enjoyed by a privileged few, and too many communities get left behind on money and priorities. And that's something that I've been working on with my colleagues, especially in some of our outer boroughs. We need to ensure that the city is both providing and protecting open space for all New Yorkers in every neighborhood across all 5 boroughs. And the only way to do that is through public investment. Through my time in the council, I've brought millions of dollars to parks, to pedestrian plazas, to fixing those holes in some of the ground to make sure that it's safe, and for not just for all kinds of people that are going through the park, for NYCHA campuses and those open spaces, for school open spaces. And I think we have a lot of power through our discretionary funding and those allocations. And a lot of those initiatives are life-saving. So it's capital, but it's also programmatic. And there's advocate-led initiatives that include Families for Safe Streets, youth sports. I had to help fund a basketball tournament that I myself used to play in as a kid at Hamilton Fish, and I was proud to do that. But we also have to remember that all of that is connected as to how we keep people outside involved, but feeling like they're supported and they have enough resources. And that's everything from even environmental educational programs like the Lower East Side Ecology Center. And as speaker, I will make investments in green spaces that is equitable for every borough.
Thank you. And Mr. Powers.
Thank you. First of all, I should mention I am happy, and a lot of us supported a budget this year that got funding back into our parks and put money back to where it should have been before COVID. But we shouldn't have to get into these fights every single year about us and the mayor over what exactly the budget should be for parks, which is why I do, like others, support some baseline of 1% or more that would make sure that a starting point is a serious investment in parks, not what we debate and negotiate with folks. But beyond that as well, I think what we've seen during COVID is making investments in spaces where it's lower capital and we can easily turn public spaces into parks. In my district on Waterside Pier, we did a quick and easy conversion of a space that can be now turned into a park without much capital money put into it. Obviously, Councilmember Rivera and others have really talked about a lot about open streets, and that program immediately converted our streets into space. So we should be looking for things that don't cost a lot of money also to turn into public spaces, because as everybody will tell you and everybody's said on here, the capital process with parks is completely broken. I would also add that I think in year one of our next term in the Adams administration, we should go beyond the 1% to make a serious investment in just making sure the basics of keeping the parks clean, getting them modernized, keeping them safe. We make a serious investment right up front in all of our parks, the neighborhood ones and the big ones that we all cherish as well, and then go onto the 1% commitment so that we don't lose our progress over the years. And we don't have other cities with these beautiful spaces and not a long way behind when it comes to our parks.
Great, thank you. And the next question, a lot of you brought it up, so it seems like a natural transition, and it is what you would do as speaker to reform the procurement process, to bring down costs, speed up timelines, and help deliver more vital social infrastructure projects for New Yorkers. So going back to Ms. Brewer.
Well, I think the procurement process has, it's across the board. It's not just in parks. I mean, the Department of Education takes 2 years to get a smart board when you put the money in. And so I think that to answer your question specifically, the process has to have a complete redo. Now, it's not to say that people on this call and many before haven't tried. So I cannot say specifically what needs to be done. It's the same issue with the non-transparent capital budget. What is in that capital budget? When I came in to be president, I had wonderful relations with Scott Stringer, but we had millions of dollars that were unspent. And if I hadn't said something, those dollars would stay at OMB. So there is a real challenge to figuring out the non-transparent capital must be transparent. And same thing with the procurement process. Now, you have public money, so it's not like you're working for a private firm. It has to be available to the public so they know what they're getting. And you have to find the balance between the cheapest and the one that you're getting most for your money. And the example, of course, that Colonel Young was a good one. My goodness, $11 million versus $5 or $6 million, is a big difference. So the question is, what are you getting for the 11 versus the private funding, which we got from the district attorney's office? And, you know, we got to do labor. We always want to make sure it's a union job. We also want to make sure that it's a kind of job that is going to be lasting and sustainable. But there has to be something in that delta that makes more sense. And the speed. I mean, a lot of firms will not bid with the city of New York because it takes so long. So the question is, can you pay people faster so that they will bid? And then the procurement process would be faster. I don't know, Katie, there's so many things wrong with the procurement process. I worked a lot with the tech front because that's my background. And, you know, sometimes you get a tech project, by the time it's bid and out the door, the technology is no longer relevant. So the whole entire procurement from one topic to the another needs a real redo. And, you know, again, people have tried, but I do think with this smart group of incoming council members, we have a chance to do it. So I would put a lot of focus as speaker on procurement and transparent capital.
Great. Mr. Brannan?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we need to make procurement reform sexy again. You know, it's not an exciting topic, but it's really, really, really important on myriad levels. And as the former contracts chair, you know, the stuff that I saw was really horrifying. We have to digitize, I think, the entire process from start to finish. There's got to be certain timelines for project benchmarks that are mandated so that there's incentives to finish projects on time or before schedule or under cost. You know, it's become a joke. I mean, it's become sort of a punchline that a bathroom in a park costs $3 million and my cousin Jerry could redo your bathroom in a weekend for $5,000 at Home Depot. It's not okay. And I think we need to realize that I'll give you, for instance, I had a park in my district that is right near a high school. And therefore we were able to get the school construction authority to actually do the project. School construction authority actually gets procurement right, and they know how to do stuff on time. Because we were able to get the SCA to build this park, this giant, beautiful track and field, it was done in a year the way it should be done. If it was done by the Parks Department, they would still be building it now. So why aren't we sharing these best practices between different agencies? If School Construction Authority can do it in a year, then why does it take 3-4 years for the Parks Department to do it? I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel here. We just need to figure out best practices and share those best practices between agencies.
Great, thank you. Mr. Moya? Well, you're muted. There you go.
There I go. Sorry. Look, I've observed in my own neighborhood in the past 4 years, I was quoted $5 million for a comfort station in a local park. That's outrageous. And the timeline for that is 6 to 7 years. The process for design and building when it comes to capital projects is clearly broken. And we have to be able to make major investments on projects that come in on budget, they come in below budget, they come in on an agreed timeline. We need to have that built with our union expertise that are able to do these projects together. You know, we live in a world that of limited budgets here, and so we have to maximize our dollars in the way that that benefits the most number of New Yorkers, with a particular focus on the underserved areas here in the city of New York. Look, we've held hearings on this. I sit on the Parks Committee. This is a big problem. We thought that maybe with the state coming in last year with passing design build, which would then give any projects that are over $1.5 million, especially when it comes to parks, would help streamline a lot of this process here. Because my colleagues here will all say the same thing, right? We see the projects that we want to fund, and then there is a 2-year scoping, design, and by the time things are ready to get built, we're not even going to be in office anymore. It is something that we need to start streamlining. It needs to be corrected. We know that parks play an important role in the health of not just our environment, but our communities. And we need to do this in a real way. And I think that by streamlining a lot of this process, hopefully with design build coming in as well, will help change that.
Great, thank you, Ms. Rivera.
Absolutely. I mean, this is about making city agencies more efficient, streamlining the process, as my colleagues mentioned. I know there are a lot of restrictions on construction that are onerous, and projects are often delayed and they're over budget. A lot of the time, these delays are also a product of capacity. So I would push to invest more on in-house capacity at the Parks Department. We need to hire more designers, trades workers, maintenance staff to do things like complete some of the smaller scale projects and maintain the parks we have before they fall into disrepair and require major capital dollars. And we should be having those same teams conducting maintenance reports, having a capital needs assessment so that any capital planning can be proactive and be comprehensive. And we have to build these in-house design teams who can standardize and streamline park elements for ultimately cheaper and faster production. And as part of the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project in my district, the first resiliency project of its scale, the Parks Department staff installed turf on some of the asphalt playgrounds. I'm told for the first time they did this in-house. They also did sports coating, they added barbecue pits, mobile lights, all without spending even $1 of capital funding and within a 2-year timeline. And so we have to build on this method going forward, in addition to revamping the procurement process that we've all kind of belabored on, which has, been challenging for many, many years.
Thank you. Mr. Powers.
Thanks. We've hit on a lot of them, but one is we passed a law in 2018 that is the capital projects tracker for the Parks Department, where you can now go see where those projects stand at a certain point in time and what phase they're in. And I think I've noticed some projects that we have funded aren't appearing on there. We have to make sure that people in the public have an opportunity to have the clear information of what's getting funded. And we should also look at that for other places too, for other agencies beyond the Parks Department. Second is I think Councilmember Rivera said, investing in the Parks Department also means investing in places where we can speed up those processes and give more staff and resources to actually move some of those projects along. I'm hopeful design build will be one way to help continuing to move projects along. I think there's a certain threshold for what projects qualify for design builds. We might want to look at lowering that threshold for projects that we're funding right here in the city council that might fall below that. And I think somebody in the chat brought up maintenance, but maintenance is one way to make sure that when you build a project, we also just do it standalone. We just build it and we walk away from it, but that we actually have some money or funding to make sure that we can do maintenance on it over the next few years. Because that way we don't have to replace the equipment and start all over. We can actually put money in the budgets right now to make sure that we're doing the maintenance on the parks, and that way we can save ourselves the 3-5 years that it often can take to get the funding and move through the process. So I think it's something we all really care about. And I think it would be wise to think about whether in the next administration, there should be some position that's more clearly overseeing infrastructure and procurement that oversees DDC, SCA, the Parks Department, all these processes. I love Lorraine Grillo. I think she's doing a great job. I think somebody like her should be, the type of person who can oversee lots of different agencies or projects to make sure they move along.
Great, and thank you. And just again, a programming note, Gale Brewer had to step out briefly, but she will, just like the council, she will be back. So our next question, Justin will lead off. And it actually gets into something that you spoke about, Keith, the management of open spaces. Now our public realm, which includes parks and plazas and waterfronts and streets and sidewalks, they're all managed by different agencies, often with different rules and priorities and different procurement, as we talked about, rather than working as a connected network. So as speaker, would you support the creation of a director of the public realm? And we'll start off with Mr. Brannan.
Absolutely. I think, I have a beautiful waterfront in my district that's a promenade, bike path, fishing, biking, running. It's amazing. And I think there's about 75 different city agencies that have jurisdiction over this bike path. And it's just completely insane and doesn't have to be like that. I think this all sort of dovetails with the need for a real holistic vision for our precious open green space, and that ties together all this stuff, right? That ties together parks and climate resiliency and equitable access and public health and equitable economic development. And I think having someone sort of an open space czar who oversees all these programs is really a no-brainer, especially as we're putting sort of, giving power back to the people, whether it's through open streets or the open play streets that we have now for schools, where we're really giving the power back to the people. Basically NYPD maybe drop off some of the sawhorses, but really that's all that they do. I think it's important that you don't have a giant bureaucracy handling all this, that you have a consolidated place and a czar that can oversee all these things. I think it's a no-brainer. So I would absolutely support creating that position.
Thank you. Mr. Moya?
Yeah, look, I too support the creation of a director for the public realm. We need to do a better job as a city of supporting our open and green spaces. We have to have a very coordinated effort to ensure that all public spaces have the support that they need to actually thrive. And we do need to ensure that our local and neighborhood groups and gardens that provide great benefits to so many New York neighborhoods are provided with the resources that they need, so no matter what their sizes are. So like I'm about making sure that we have all stakeholders that are empowered to protect open and green spaces in their communities, and to have access to the expertise, the information, and the tools that are needed to maintain and improve our city. And I believe that by having a director that can help make sure that we're streamlining all of these things and getting the community input is what makes the best sense as we move forward as a city.
Thank you. Ms. Rivera?
Yes, I would support the creation of a director of the public realm. That's because we need the technical expertise that each city brings to the table. And what we really need is for all of the agencies to be working together in lockstep. So having this person in the mayor's office who can work to coordinate with all parties to ensure that we have a comprehensive understanding of public space. And a comprehensive city plan, for example, this position would be vital in guaranteeing equitable green and open space. And further, I would just say that we need to make sure that this person is considering intersecting issues like open space and housing justice and environmental justice, among other things, in their decision-making.
Thank you. And Mr. Powers?
Yes, I definitely support it. If you look at one of the things I've been fighting for is just on the sort of along the FDR in my district, looking at the waterfront there as you get to the UN and you get to Waterside Plaza. We don't have a connected waterfront in my district. And when you get to those areas, you start running into Department of Transportation, EDC, and a number of other agencies that have jurisdiction over one piece of land. So we do need somebody who can sit these agencies down and coordinate them to look long-term, invest in open space, to help maintain and uphold programs like open dining and open streets, and to continue to invest in those programs, to think bigger about what the next step is. So I mentioned we need somebody to do the infrastructure side of this to make sure we move capital projects along. We need somebody to also sit down there and have a vision and to oversee all the different city agencies that are managing the public spaces and public realm. And when you talk about just look at my district, we have lots of new pedestrian spaces we're creating. We have the waterfront. We have, of course, big parks like Central Park and Bryant Park, but we have the neighborhood parks that people love. We have open streets and open dining. We have a lot of different ways that people can use space, but nobody's looking at them every single day. No one's enforcing rules around pops. There's lots of work to do. And I do think we need to dedicate somebody and a team really to be doing that work every single day and not be siloed off in City Hall.
Great, thank you. And it's a good transition to our next question. During the pandemic and continuing, as we hopefully get out of the pandemic, programs like Open Streets and Open Restaurants were innovations by necessity that extended a lifeline to communities across the city and literally thousands of small businesses. What is your vision for a successful, equitable, and permanent iteration of these programs to support our city and recovery? And we kick off with Mr. Brannan.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been amazing. I mean, when we first started talking about this, I think it was hard for people to envision, and people coming to terms with, well, where am I going to park versus how is my local restaurant going to survive? You saw a lot of people's heads exploding with that decision making. But it's been amazing, and it's been an absolute lifeline and godsend for so many small businesses in our city. And it's just an amazing use of open space, and it's successful and it's doing well and it's popular and everyone is surviving somehow with a couple less parking spots. I think obviously support the Department of City Planning looking to make it permanent. I do think there are ways to certainly make it more equitable. I do think that we need to find a way where, I think a lot of times what you hear from restaurants now is that they're sort of waiting for the other shoe to drop, and they're worried that one day the city is going to come knocking on their door and say, okay, now we're going to start charging for this stuff. So we have to find a way to ensure that that's not going to happen. And if it does happen, that it's done equitably and done fairly. The cost of having a sidewalk cafe license before the open streets and outdoor dining programs was just insane. And I'm concerned that at some point the city will say, well, we miss getting that money. So I think it really comes down to making sure that our small businesses are not going to get subtly blindsided if we decide to start monetizing the outdoor dining. But otherwise, I think it's an amazing program, and it should be made permanent, and it should be made more equitable in how it's given to restaurants. And some restaurants that don't have, if there's a fire hydrant outside or a bus stop that they can't take advantage of it. There's got to be ways to expand it, and I would support that just because it's been so popular.
Great, thank you, Mr. Moya.
Look, the Open Streets program is a wonderful program. It allowed thousands of restaurants to survive during the pandemic. Open Streets allowed New Yorkers to reimagine the view of what streets can be. But unfortunately, with the open restaurant programs, it created some bad actors who ignored rules and failed to maintain good standing in their neighborhoods. And one of the things where I do support that the Open Streets program, the Open Restaurants program, but to me, moving forward, we just can't have a blanket approach to these types of programs across the city. We have to listen to the needs of the community. We have to work very closely with the restaurant industry, labor, the neighborhood groups to ensure that we can create an effective and ongoing program that works for all stakeholders. There has to be sort of a unified approach of how these structures are built for the safety of the community and the people who utilize this, because there's some people that don't maintain the structures appropriately. We are having a hearing that is happening tomorrow on this. City Planning has been listening to this. Like I said, I do support the open restaurants program. I just think that we have to look at how there is a sort of unified way of these structures maintaining the safety and cleanliness of our community as well. Because we want our restaurants to survive this, but we also want to make sure that all the safety measures that go into this are put into place as well. And that there's a unified way of doing this, so that there's an understanding, a clear understanding of the restaurant owners of what they have to do in order to maintain this and how to build that structure accordingly.
Thank you. Ms. Rivera.
It's a great question. When I wrote the bill for emergency open streets at the height of the pandemic, New York, New Yorkers, we all had this need for open space. It was urgent. It was absolutely undeniable. And over a year later, the positive impact that the program has had on our communities could not have been clearer. So there was no question we had to make open streets permanent in New York City. And the whole vision for open streets was to lead to using our street space for restaurants, for our schools. It led to, the open businesses, and of course, open culture. And Avenue B in my district, along with phenomenal open streets like 34th Avenue, Jackson Heights, and several others, they've proven kind of this overwhelming success of open streets when they are properly invested in with resources and with support. So we made it central to our legislation that any community that wanted it, where it's appropriate, could have an open street, and they would have access to city support and resources. And that way we could ensure equity and access. It wouldn't be equitable if we only relied on volunteers, because that assumes that there are people who are able to take the time away from work and other responsibilities to coordinate a whole community program. And that's not realistic and that's not fair. So that said, we still need the Department of Transportation to step up and to fulfill their end of the legislation that we passed so that there's equity in the program. And just today, I published an op-ed with incoming Bronx Borough President Vanessa Gibson, highlighting the fact that the limited open streets we do have is not distributed equitably. There are no active open streets in any of the 6 community boards that have the fewest residents living near parks. And of all the active open streets miles in operation today, only 2.2% are in the Bronx. So the next council has a real opportunity to make sure that this program becomes all that it can be. And as Speaker, I'll make sure that we continue our oversight of the program and to find opportunities to help the program grow in a way that makes sense throughout all 5 boroughs, especially where the need is the greatest. And for outdoor dining, it provided one of the only lifelines to keep our restaurants in business during COVID. There's no arguing that. And these restaurants they're a big private employer. And I know that my district is certainly dependent on that workforce and the money that it brings in. So of course, always room for improvement. And when we make changes in the ways that we design our streets, some things take more effort and creativity to work out. So if, making open streets and open restaurants permanent, we're essentially giving the city the opportunity to plan our street space accordingly moving forward. And I think that's really, really exciting. This is a chance for a transformative change.
Thank you. The op-ed's on city limits for those curious, so you can read it there. Thank you, Mr. Powers.
Yeah, I'm a son of a restaurant owner, unequivocal supporter and champion of outdoor dining. I think not only was it the best or one of the best things that New York City did innovatively during the COVID crisis, but I think it is a real lifeline for these restaurants in the future and part of our recovery here, because the hospitality industry is going to continue to be impacted by the lack of folks who are visiting the city and the constant COVID's concerns. So I think continuing it is going to be essential, and creating fair rules and how it operates is going to be a big part of that. And I think as we look at the city planning, moving it to city planning and having to come to the council for a vote, I think we have to pass regulations alongside of it that are fair and balanced to the communities where there's so much impact. But in both, I think they're open streets and open dining, things that have to be around for the future. In my district, like in K-Town, for instance, we had both. We had streets that were open streets closed down, and the dining was there as well. And I thought it was a great and perfect way to look at areas like that are really tourist attractions and places where people want to visit, whether you're local or you're coming to New York City for the very first time.
Great, thank you. And this next question, again, on how we utilize our streets. So Transportation Alternatives 25 by 25 plan seeks to reclaim 25% of our street space for pedestrians by 2025. Do you support this proposal, and how can the council lead work to prioritize pedestrians, cyclists, buses, and pedestrian plazas over cars? Kick it to you, Mr. Brannan.
Thank you. It's a great question. We've done a lot of work out in Southern Brooklyn around street safety, and up until a couple of years ago, no one was having conversations out here about traffic violence. It just wasn't a term that people used. But what's clear is that we really need a holistic approach, and it's not just about addressing incidents or issues at specific corners or corridors, but about really taking a holistic look at what needs to be done to really share and make sure that our streets and our sidewalks are shared by all, first and foremost for pedestrians, but that our streets and sidewalks can be shared and made livable by everybody. And therefore, there's a lot that needs to be done because so much of the city's space is devoted to driving or free parking, while the vast majority of New Yorkers are walking or biking or taking the subway. So it's important that we ensure that streets really serve the needs of all New Yorkers, a majority of New Yorkers. But it's also important to remember that people do drive, right? If you live in Maspeth, Queens and work in Staten Island, well, you're probably not taking the subway to work. So there needs to be a balance, and there needs to be respect first and foremost for pedestrians as the most vulnerable. But there is a way that we can get all of these things done, and it doesn't have to be an us versus them sort of scenario. And I think that's the work that I've tried to do out here, where we do have a almost suburban car culture, trying to get people to understand that there are more important things than getting from point A to point B as fast as possible when you're behind the wheel of a car. So I support the plan because we need to be clear that our public space and our streets are mainly devoted right now to driving and free storage of cars, and that's not where our focus should be.
Thank you, Mr. Moya.
Thank you. Look, our streets were not designed or intended for the number of vehicles that now exist in the city. We need to rethink our relationship with transportation, especially in light of the immediate climate challenges that we are facing, especially with the emissions that is produced by vehicles. Look, I've spent my colleagues here know I spent a lot of time in Spain, and I think that we should be looking at Barcelona, my second favorite city, as an example of how to have a better system for the public to use its streets. They've shown how a city can actually shift to ensure that the city streets can improve the lives of the public. But I also don't think that we can have a blanket approach for the entire city. I think we need to work with each community to find an appropriate balance of cars and pedestrians as we continue to move forward in our city by tackling these challenges that we're facing right now.
Thank you, Ms. Rivera.
Thank you so much for this question. Yes, I support the proposal. First and foremost, we have to work to eliminate transit deserts. That is incredibly important. I think we also have to responsibly use the money that we got from the feds to help end traffic violence. So we have to be vigilant about that. And I think most people know that since I took office, I've championed several initiatives and infrastructure projects in my district. And of course, citywide, we have the first, in my district, the first busway on 14th Street, and the way we've utilized that pedestrian space to not only make it more friendly to people who are walking and visiting the area, but also to take that space and incorporate art and culture, which I think is incredibly important. Things like bringing local artists in to paint murals. I also have the Avenue C loading zone pilot in my district, which is something that I'm really excited about to hope to expand to other places where it makes sense to help our small businesses. But again, make sure that our streets are orderly and that it makes sense for people. We have the Broadway and Union Square vision plans. We have the biggest shared street in the city, which takes up a lot of my district, but also looking at how we can expand a lot of those areas and then investing in pedestrian plazas on Broadway, but then in places like at Baruch College, which is just incredible, energetic space where we've also worked on the infrastructure to make it more resilient and included landscape improvements that are also more resilient. And then, of course, open streets, which we talked a lot about, which I think is a game changer for the city. As Speaker, I'll continue to advocate for inclusive and equitable use of our public transit and open spaces. And, anyone who knows me knows I'm on my bike all the time. And I understand that not every other district is bikeable. The way that mine's is, it's a privilege. And of course, we have to work to make sure that we're letting other council members lead. They know their districts best. They know what works and what's appropriate. So making sure that we're fighting for the funding and the legislation that makes sense so that everyone could feel like, the space is ours. The space is truly for people.
Thank you. Mr. Powers.
Yes, I do support the plan. And with regard to how can we lead, I think it's in our own districts. And in mine, we've done a lot. We've made pretty big strides when it comes to transforming our street space here, making it easier to commute and get around. That's the 14th Street Busway, which, of course, was a big deal when we passed it and now is becoming sort of the standard for ways to look at other areas of the city. We have talked about 5th Avenue, 6th Avenue, 7th Avenue in terms of making those faster, easier to get around, and of course, and safer as well. And been a big supporter of some of those projects on 6th Avenue and 7th Avenue that have gone, or 6th Avenue, for instance, have gotten completed to create an easier and safer way to get around a very busy part of New York City. And with the Manhattan Borough President, Gale Brewer, we're pushing, of course, for pedestrianization of Rockefeller Center, not just during the holiday plans, which is a plan that we help push forward, but to do it year round. And we're going to have to do a lot more in my district, which is a really high density, highly visited area of New York City, to lean into pedestrianization, both and safe ways to get around. That's going to be expanding city bikes, since Midtown is such a big part of that network, and making sure that people have access points when it comes to where they might pick up or drop off the bikes. It talks about Park Avenue right now. We're talking about transforming the Park Avenue medians and malls to do something long-term exciting there. We're talking about the waterfront on the East River and ways to make sure we have a connected waterfront here. We're talking about East Midtown, we've made hundreds of millions of dollars of investment into and collected $100 million. And I see folks from CB5 here who can speak to that. Making sure that we are upgrading our subways and creating pedestrian plazas around Grand Central. We're doing a lot in my district. I recognize that I represent sort of a busy area of the world, but I think that there's a lot of opportunities outside of Manhattan as well to make sure that we're leaning into safer and faster and greener ways to get around this city. And I really am grateful for the folks at Transalt and others who have been pushing that forward. And of course, we passed the Streets Master Plan here in the City Council. We have to make sure we implement that in the next administration and the next council as well. So there's a lot to do, but I'm confident we're going to have a lot of new members who are ready to get to work to do all of that.
Thank you. This next question, I guess, also speaks to the management of parks and open spaces. Not-for-profit partners have been an essential part of managing the city's parks in recent years. What can the council do to better support grassroots organizations and nonprofits working on open space programs like Open Streets? We will start with you, Mr. Brannan.
This is really an equity issue, because you don't see these big, well-funded alliances and groups in low-income neighborhoods, and therefore their parks and open spaces often suffer. It needs to be easier. The Parks Department, the city, has to make it easier for average citizens and residents to get involved if they want to dedicate their time or their money to making their local parks better and stronger. What I've seen in my district is you have situations where people want to take initiative and get involved and plant or build or whatever it is, and it's just not allowed. especially during COVID, when we had one parks worker doing the work of 8 or 9, and you had people who wanted to pitch in and help, but in an organized way, they were told they weren't allowed. I also see this, I have a bill in the council that would make it easier for people to hire outside contractors and vendors to do tree pruning. Right now, the tree pruning contract runs, I think it's every 95 years they come around and prune your trees. But there's people who have the wherewithal and want to prune their trees usually for safety, who are afraid to hire someone because of the fines that might be issued to them, or contractors just won't do the work because they know the fines that will be imposed on them by the city. And it's crazy. If someone wants to pay money to prune their tree or fix a sidewalk, they should be able to do it in a way that's streamlined and efficient. So I think that's all sort of part and parcel to the procurement issue. And obviously, there's labor issues here too that we have to work through, but it needs to be made easier for these local volunteer alliances to do the work that they want to do. And because it's not fair. It's an equity issue where you have these groups who have the money to do these projects, and other neighborhoods they don't, and it's just not right. It's something that needs to be fixed.
Thank you, Mr. Moya.
Hey, Katie, I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question? It got frozen for a minute.
Yeah. It's just, to summarize it, it's how will you and the speaker work to better support the grassroots organizations and the nonprofits working on open streets programs or parks groups or any kind of open street, you know what I mean?
Yeah. No, look, I think it's critical that, we are actually making investments in helping with the volunteer groups, the people that are looking at how to better build a much better New York. We know that for far too long, the procurement process has been something that has held up, the advancement of projects that we'd like to see. I think we need to ensure that we are giving as much of the ability that we can to help these groups really foster their vision in getting some of these things done, with a lot of work that we need to do at the council and including them in part of this process. It's really important for us to get the feedback from the community, also the volunteer groups, and make sure that we will have equity throughout the city when we're looking to help promote our parks throughout the city.
Thank you, Ms. Rivera.
I think the answer is professionalizing this work. So you can think about, I guess the City Cleanup Corps is a good example. These are people, individuals who take a lot of pride in their communities, who were already cleaning up their neighborhoods where they live. And then they were able to become a part of the Cleanup Corps, which is a professional path and potentially towards even a good paying union job. When I was with the Cleanup Corps, when they were in Tompkins Square Park, I spoke to an individual, a guy who grew up in the LES, and he was already doing this work where he lived in LaGuardia houses. And so I think, again, this is about professionalizing the work. I think also making sure that we're compensating and supporting these nonprofits, these groups. We did this for Open Streets. And of course, shout out to the Avenue B Community Coalition, the Lower East Sider group that is doing a lot of work on that open street, but also 34th Avenue. So these are places where we have to make sure that the city is putting up the resources. And yeah, we had to go ahead and legislate that. And if that's what has to get done to make sure that it is official, memorialized, and fully funded, then those are the steps we have to take in what I would do leading the body as speaker. I mean, I think what I've been able to prove is that the backbone of my work is relationship building, just like what we did with the Census Task Force. We needed these groups to do the work, to talk to families, to make sure that those trusted relationships and those credible messengers knew that the city was going to be able to support them, to have those intimate conversations and get people to fill out the census. So that is something that have a track record of doing, and what we have to do to make sure that these groups know that the city has their back.
Thank you. And Mr. Powers.
Yeah, thanks. It's a good question. Look, I think whether you are a large or medium-sized conservancy down to the neighborhood group doing the work, you have to have a more welcoming environment, both in the city council and in the city of New York. Those are stakeholders and partners. I see my friends at Trees in New York are here. They're one of the best neighborhood groups doing tree pruning, just doing basic maintenance. Groups like that need to be able to be funded through the council and through our process. We have to make it easier for these neighborhood groups to be able to get funding in our process, and of course, find pots of funding to continue to resource them. We have programs in the city council like the Parks Equity Initiative and others that we can use. We can resource those more if they're helpful to getting those neighborhood groups and those nonprofits more funding. But I don't want to leave out the big ones either. The conservancies also need our support. They need our partnership. They need to feel like they're real stakeholders in the decisions that are made. I have Central Park and Bryant Park and a number of these big groups who obviously are well resourced, but sometimes are left out of the conversation when it comes to what's actually happening in their parks. So I think it's a welcoming environment. 2 is more resources, and the council can help provide that. And 3 is to break down these processes that make it extremely difficult for them to get a foot in the door in the first place. And as a speaker, I would be committed to doing all 3 of those things.
Great, thank you. We have a few more questions, but I wanted to jump to everyone's favorite part of a forum, which is the lightning round questions. So these will be very quick. We'll do it in the same order that you were answering questions in, but we will start with, what is your favorite park? You Justin, sorry.
Shore Road Park, where I grew up. That was my backyard.
And then Mr. Moya.
I mean, come on, I started out where my mom and dad met at Flushing Meadows Corona Park. Can't beat that.
Ms. Rivera.
Hamilton Fish, I mentioned the basketball tournament, but it's got that swimming pool too.
Mr. Powers.
I love Stide Cove Park, which is on the waterfront near me, but also Greenacre Park in mine, which is actually one of the few privately funded parks here in the city, but is a really good rescue here in the city for a lot of Midtown folks.
The next question, when was the last time you rode a bike and where'd you ride it to? Mr. Brannan.
Geez. It was during the middle of COVID, probably. Wow, it was a while ago. Maybe a year ago. I rode it to get a slice of pizza.
Where'd you get a slice of pizza?
Nino's. It kind of canceled out the whole bike ride because I just went to get pizza. So,
Mr. Moya.
It was about 2 weeks ago over by the lake in Flushing Meadows. I was teaching my niece how to ride her bike.
Oh, that's right. Ms. Rivera.
Today, I mean, sometimes I ride it to the train and rode it to the farmer's market.
And Mr. Powers.
I think yesterday, I ride one a lot. I go to my office on a city bike most days, and I think I rode it home yesterday.
Great. Next question. What's the last open restaurant you went to? Mr. Brannan.
El Coliseo on 18th Avenue and 77th Street, but don't tell anybody because it's a hidden gem.
Secrets out. Mr. Moya.
I was at Sarahina's out in Brooklyn for some brick oven pizza the other night.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Ms. Rivera.
King in West Village.
Mr. Powers.
I eat at open restaurants like 4 times a week, but at this point, I think it was in K-Town in my district, one of the restaurants there.
Great. And our last question, what's your favorite open street, Mr. Brannan?
We do one in Bay Ridge on 5th Avenue. It's not permanent, but when we do it, it's fun.
Mr. Moya?
Vanderbilt Ave over in Brooklyn.
Ms. Rivera?
Avenue B, shout out to Lower East Side Open Streets Community Coalition.
And Mr. Powers?
I love the one on K-Town, but I got to say Avenue B is a pretty damn good one too. And I shout out to them as well. They're doing a great job.
Thank you. So yeah, and just a programming note, we were trying to get Gale Brewer back, but we'll just move on to the other questions. And this next section is focused on how to make our shared infrastructure more resilient. So as we all saw earlier this year, Hurricane Ida, we saw how our city remains incredibly vulnerable to flooding and the impacts of climate change. So as speaker, how would you make our streets more resilient and put in place policies that help prevent flooding across the sewer system and into places with damaging consequences, like our subway stations and basement homes? Mr. Brannan, we'll start with you.
Sure. We are now under siege by climate change in ways that scientists have warned us about for years. And you're seeing these cascading disasters now that are no longer features of some dystopian future, but they're here and now. And I often say that fighting back is going to require big, bold policy. It's also going to require sweating the small stuff, such as sewer maintenance. We had a hearing after the last storm where we talked to DEP about our sewers. And right now, the sewers at the city, the existing sewers and the ones that they're installing, could only handle about 1.5 inches to 2 inches of rain an hour. And now you're seeing storms that are giving us 3 inches of rain an hour. We're having these once in a lifetime storms twice a month. So I think we resiliency here, the city has always come back stronger, that's guaranteed, but we have to come back smarter. We have to move forward more informed about the risks that we face and better able to prepare and protect our future. And I think part of that, certainly what I think we learned through COVID, is pulling back the veil of exceptionalism a little bit. New York City is the greatest city in the world, but if other cities or states or countries are doing things better than we are when it comes to resiliency, as it relates to streetscape and porous surfaces and bioswales, whatever it may be, we have a lot to learn. And we can't be so proud of how great we are that we're not willing to learn or steal ideas from other cities that are doing things better than we are. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We know what to do, but I think we need to be unafraid to take ideas from other cities that are doing things better than we are.
Great, thank you, Mr. Moya.
Look, for me, the health of the environment is paramount to our city's our city's health, prosperity, and economic vitality. Hurricane Ida had a profound impact on our city. We need to ensure that the federal infrastructure bill will have a profound impact on our city. That's why it's really important for us to also have a strong, unified relationship with our state and federal partners here, because that's what's really going to help bring that federal money that we need to really do great infrastructure projects that will help us in the future, because there is no denying that climate change is having a real effect on the city. We've seen storm after storm come in, and for me, I believe that we really need to create and to implement a resiliency plan that protects all neighborhoods and residents in our city.
Thank you. And I just want to note, Gale Brewer is back. Gale Brewer again. So we're going to have you jump in and ask. We're going to go out of order, but the question was basically how to make our streets more resilient. We saw the devastating effects of climate change and flooding during Hurricane Ida this year. So how would you work to make streets more resilient and put in place policies that help prevent flooding across the sewer system and other streets? So if you just want to, we'll go to you there. And then we'll go to Mr. Rivera and Mr. Powers.
Okay, I mean, the issue with the streets is there's a couple of issues. I know that on the combined sewage overflow, which is the CSO, I always thought that, for $1 gazillion, you might be able to fix them. That's one of the reasons I think that we have streets that are flooded. But it's probably too expensive to do a major. I know working with Councilmember Powers and Councilmember Rivera, we've all focused on this East River Park. And so just to give an example of how challenging this overflow problem is, I just did a tour, I think mostly in the northern part in Councilmember Powers' area, of the renovation of the park. And what's interesting to me is they, meaning the Department of Design and the contractors, are digging up the park and figuring out how to deal with the flow of water and the sewage. So I said, so this is great. So you can redo the combined sewage overflow, because what do I know? Well, it turns out they can't. In other words, they'll do some in terms of figuring out how to deal with the sewage, and there will be more capacity for holding rainwater. But if there's too much, it's going to go into, God help us, the East River. So then I think, oh my goodness, so that can't even be done here. How are we going to do it with all of our streets? So I would just say we do need to work with the Department of Environmental Protection on what we can do for storing more rainwater so that it doesn't end up in the rivers. That would be number one. And then the second issue is, I know that we'll talk perhaps later, or maybe you did, about this issue of a director of public realm. But I don't know what, there are about 25 agencies, including DEP, that work in our streets. And so who is going to be in charge of all of these agencies that do not coordinate now and probably don't talk to each other? So I don't know enough about bike lanes, bus lanes, restaurants that are open in the parking lanes, not to mention the issue of just plain old sanitation. How can all of those be improved in terms of communication so that you do not end up with some of the flooding and some of the challenges? Now, Manhattan's a little bit higher. I know you in Queens and elsewhere, you're always flooding. Sorry, Councilmember Moya, you guys are always flooding. But we tend to be a little bit higher, although Lower East Side got killed in the hurricanes. So we're here to say that I think this is a very expensive, but there could be many, many mitigation before we end up having to fix the whole CSO issue.
Great, thank you, Ms. Rivera.
Thanks for the question. I mean, there are a lot of new green infrastructure developments that we're just beginning to embrace in New York City. As Speaker, I'd uplift any efforts to continue to bring these features to every street in every neighborhood where appropriate. So things like bioswales, which turn our street trees into sustainable stormwater collection, and then the parallel conveyance upgrades to our sewer infrastructure that serves to protect communities from flooding during heavy rainfall by optimizing our current drainage system and adding new drainage in parallel to existing infrastructure, which is, it's a lot of work, but it's totally worth it, and it's worth the planning, and it has to happen right away. And this is just a sampling of the upgrades that we're pursuing through efforts related to the Eastside Coastal Resiliency Project, and it's imperative that we expand them citywide. So the bioswales and the reinforced sewage lines for street resiliency, legalize basement apartments so they can actually have safety regulations in place because people are going to continue living in them. And harm mitigation needs to come from both ends. So we have to make basement apartments safer, but also make sure that already safe dwelling spaces are actually available and affordable to help meet our need. We have a severe lack of affordable housing, which we need to solve for a number of reasons, but we also have to make affordable housing more accessible so fewer people, so that way fewer people can be in these situations. I have legislation to do that called COPA. I truly believe that housing is a climate issue, which is why I bring it up. And then in terms of some of the federal funding that we got in that 10 billion that's going to go to transit, that transit money should also be coupled with climate resiliency. And then finally, we have to invest in and implement resiliency plans in all 5 boroughs. That has to happen now, and making sure that the Eastside Coastal Resiliency Project is a model and we can do it appropriately and even better in other parts of the city.
Great, thank you. Mr. Powers.
Thank you. And I want to note there's a mounting Katie Honan for Speaker campaign happening on Twitter right now. So I just want to know that you're
No way.
right now. 2 things here. I mean, number one is I think we have to do the hard and long-term infrastructure projects that are going to protect our waterfront from all these different weather events and are going to keep residents like the ones where I live in Stuyvesant Town who got hit hard during Hurricane Sandy. Of course, places like the Rockaways, you got hit in Brooklyn, they got hit really, really hard. Make sure we're doing the resiliency, and we're going to have to put together a long-term plan for protecting the waterfront. And we're seeing some of those plans happening now, but we're going to have a 5-borough plan that includes hardening the infrastructure here. And 2 is we need, in the last couple of weather events, I think have really proven that we don't have agencies ready or capable to, or ready, I should say, to be able to go out and do the basics, clean the gutters and the sewers out so we can avoid flooding, find some way to immediately protect the subway stations and do some of the operational things. When we have a snowstorm in New York City, you have a Department of Sanitation that can completely and kind of miraculously transform into the folks that can help pick our city right back up and put it back to normal when it comes to fighting against snow. We have nothing like that when it comes to hurricanes right now. So I think we do need some operational way, like a climate corps or some other way to mobilize agencies and have somebody coordinating that to make sure we're doing the immediately operational stuff within 12, 10, 24 hours before a major hurricane or major weather event. And that's something I think we have to start talking about right now so that, basements aren't getting flooded, subway stations aren't getting heavily flooded. We're not losing our streets and everything else to 24 hours of rain. And I think that's one of the big ideas we're going to have to look at in the next couple of years, is how to make our agencies able to go out and do that type of work.
Great, thank you. And, I did want to get to some of these audience questions. We won't unfortunately be able to get to all of them or many of them, but there's one that we kind of also wanted to ask, and it speaks to equity within parks. So we're going to start with Gale, just because she hasn't been, we've been kicking it to Justin the whole time. So the city recently announced funding for the Parks Department's Community Parks Initiative, which makes sure residents are part of the process for designing park projects through community input sessions. Would you commit to supporting or expanding the program to ensure equity as well as community participation in the process? Gale, we will start with you.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, yes. And I know the program well, and I will say that, from what I can see, it's a limited number of parks. So that's why the 1% to 4% is so needed. I mean, this is capital, I understand that. But the point is, I had to put every penny I possibly could into parks. And I assume the council members have done the same in Manhattan. It is because of the use and because of the decrepit state lack of maintenance in the past, even though there are some parks that are gonna be able to be renovated or restored based on these equity effort. Oh my goodness, there's so many others that are not. And it's not just even pre-pandemic, it was a terrible situation. I would also add to this equity issue, playgrounds. I don't know if you talked about this, but I don't know. I have to say, 2003, I started talking about this. The issue is you have school playgrounds, some of which are joint with parks and they're open on the weekends. And then some of the ones that are trust for the public land are open on the weekends and the evenings and the summer. But then you have a whole bunch of other ones that are not. The Bloomberg administration says if you can walk to a park in 10 minutes, we're not opening up your playground. I don't want those playgrounds open. I want the custodians to have the money to be able to clean them so that they're ready for the students Monday morning. But I want to add that to the list of equity that needs to be done, because guess what? There's so many playgrounds in communities that need, if you have near, as I do, a jointly operated playground on the weekends, you can't even find this turf. There's so many people using it. So while we're talking about parks, it is a large, and then the open streets also need assistance. I know some streets that are not yet open, but people want them to be not only open, but green. And in today's world, not everybody likes a turf. I know, I hear about it all the time. We all want natural grass, okay. But for a street to be open with something that is green in terms of its usability for sports and lounging and so on, all of this is possible. So the answer to your question is yes to all of the money that is allocated to the equity issue in terms of the park, but I got a whole bunch more that aren't on the list. And now I have a whole bunch more that aren't even on any list that need to be considered for open space in a real way. So yes to the question, but much more has to be done.
Thank you. Mr. Brannan.
Since being elected, I've allocated around over $30 million in investments across a dozen parks and playgrounds in my district, and it's really just barely scratching the surface. I think this is why dedicating just 1% of the city's budget to parks would bring us closer to the, depending on who you ask, generous funding levels of the past. As council members, we get a finite amount of capital, and there's a lot of need. And one thing I'm hearing from a lot of incoming members and our soon-to-be colleagues is where do you start? And it feels almost insurmountable, especially if you're in a district like mine and like many, where you've got parks and playgrounds that haven't seen any love in 20 or 30 years, if not more. And some of this needs to really be baseline, because it's very expensive, as for all the reasons we've been talking about, especially because of procurement dysfunction. But this is money that really should be baselined by City Hall, by the other side of City Hall. For us to allocate the tiny bit of money that we have every year and chipping away at different projects across our districts is very, very hard. And really going into our second term, anything that we fund in the next 4 years, we'll be lucky if we're still in office by the time any of this stuff gets done. So it all goes back to procurement reform, but I also think there needs to be more of a buy-in to the overall parks budget, so that a lot of this stuff is just taken care of not because the council member prioritizes it, but because the city as a whole prioritizes that no park or playground should go 30 years without getting some TLC.
Thank you, Mr. Moya.
Thank you, Katie. Look, for me, the community input is so important when it comes to when we talk about park equities here. No one knows what they'd like to see and what they envision than folks that live in our communities throughout the city. What we face here all the time is exactly that. Is we are looking at a budget that is consistently overinflated. I mean, I have to ask them to fix what is like actual potholes in a local park in the middle of the basketball court where, you know, kids can't play, or if they do, they're going to get hurt. The timeline that is given to me is about 2 years in order to get that fixed. 2 years and an overinflated cost that is above $250,000. I mean, look, we are facing a serious crisis here. I agree that we do need to be streamlining a lot of these basic funding issues that we face in our local parks throughout the city, because we are again looking at how we want projects to take place. It will not get done in a time frame that our communities will be able to actually enjoy. Explain that to someone in your community that says, look, we're going to fix this park. I'm sorry, you won't be able to play basketball here for the next 3 to 5 years until we actually redo this, right? These are things that need to get cured, and they need to get cured immediately. We have to break through this cycle that we've faced for so many years in the city of New York. And now is a real moment. As Speaker, I promise to be working not just with my colleagues, but also with the new administration that's coming in to really fix this problem. We got to cure this, and we can do this because it's been done in other areas. So we need to ensure that we are making this a top priority going into next year.
Thank you, Ms. Rivera.
I think the question was about community design, right?
Yeah, and just in general, in terms of getting community input when money allocated to design parks.
Awesome. Okay. So yes, absolutely. I support that. I think, you know, the community engagement process is so critical to getting people's buy-in. So whether you're talking about Parks Without Borders, which actually could be a very, very controversial issue, which I went through here in my community, to making sure that you adequately publicize in multiple languages when there's a scoping session or a conversation with the Parks Department, to yes, making sure that some of these playgrounds are open. And I was able to secure funding to make sure that our Trust for Public Land playgrounds were open during the weekends. And we shouldn't have to fight for that, but that's the reality. But the community design piece is so important, because I will tell you, when we were first organizing for the funding for the Eastside Coastal Resiliency Project, we were involved in a federal competition called Rebuild by Design. And that involved numerous workshops for the community to come together and ultimately create and choose a design for that park. And so what we decided together was that we wanted the amenities that already existed, because that is what we treasured and what we love. So the playgrounds and the barbecue areas and the tennis courts and the amphitheater, that is why there is so much support to get this done as soon as possible, because we will get our beloved park back. And just making sure that, you know, we are looking at, when we are negotiating and designing something, that there's always increased green space, but that there is a community advisory group that could also oversee the process. That's really, really important, and something that we secured with the SCR and could really help. There are limitations to that, but with an elected official that's very, very involved, and a dedicated board that's diverse, that really does cover the spectrum of people kind of in support, in opposition, in the middle, you can have a really, really productive conversation. Community engagement.
Oh, sorry. And thank you, Mr. Powers.
Yep. Thanks, Katie. We've done a process like this in my district at St. Barb Park, where the mayor put funding in, I put funding in to upgrade one of the neighborhood's really most important and most used parks. And as part of that design, as we were looking to turf it, upgrade equipment in there, it started with the community. Obviously, the community board is always involved, but it started with the folks that live in around that area. The parents tell us, how they like to see that playground utilized, formatted, upgraded. And what was great about it is you get the community's buy-in. So when you change the usage of it, when you turf a playground where kids used to play, used to bike or do other uses, that you have the community giving input, and it made the project a lot better. It made us be able to really accommodate lots of different uses and lots of different people in the community who saw that playground or that park as something different for them and their family. And so I think it's a great process. And I think if it's not happening anytime we modernize or upgrade or create a new park, it should be. And it should be that folks who live in those areas have a direct say in exactly how we're formatting or changing something in there. I think you end up with a better design, and I think you end up with their buy-in on something that can be a little difficult as you're doing a transition in that park. And I think St. Varden's turned out well because we really had the families and people that live around there speaking out loud about what they wanted to see happen.
Great, thank you. So that's our last question. We're going to kick it to closing remarks. We're going to do it in the order we had with Gale starting. Gale, you did miss the lightning round, so if you want to include your favorite, the last time you rode a bike and your favorite open street, but any kind of closing remarks you want to include, everyone will go in that order. So if you would like to begin, Gale.
My favorite park, I must admit, is Riverside Park, to be honest with you, and rode the bike recently just because got to get some exercise, and my bike is so old though that it didn't go really well, but I do ride my bike. I want to say thank you to everybody who loves parks, including colleagues, and I think that this is perhaps our, the topic that people care most about, because it's across the board. Everybody loves being in a park. We just do not have enough money for them. And I hope that people understand that I'm running for speaker because I think that strong leadership can make a positive difference in improving the lives of every New Yorker, and parks are perhaps the best way to do it. They can make everyone on an equitable basis if they are maintained, but we need everything from the maintenance people. We need the street trees to be canopy for the parks, but also for our streets. And we certainly need, as we've heard over and over again, to figure out the funding and figure out the procurement process. Without that, I'm not sure we're going to get very far. But the parks are part of every part of our recovery. Recently on an economic development forum, I was interested. The number one issue was open space needed and the arts. So I can't imagine two topics that we love more, but that need to be supported in terms of New York coming back. Parks are part of that. So I think generally I'm really supportive of what has been discussed today, but I also believe that without the funding, without the input from the community, I have to say Parks Department does do more input from the community than other agencies. Goodness knows other agencies do none in many cases. But I think what's hard about it is you wait a very long time to see the fruit of your discussion. So I want to say congratulations to New Yorkers for Parks, to Katie, and to all my colleagues, and say that I hope we have many more discussions and figure out a way to baseline increase funding for parks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Mr. Brannan, you're next.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us tonight. This is an important forum. I think like a lot of us said tonight, through COVID, people have really come to appreciate our open public green space in a brand new way. Maybe a lot of areas that we might have taken for granted. Like I said before, through the early days of COVID, I know I had some folks in my area who were enjoying their local parks for the first time ever. And that was really amazing. And I think a lot of people have completely rediscovered their public backyards and built really new relationships with these precious green spaces in an otherwise concrete jungle. We've had decades and decades of City Hall being cavalier about gutting the Parks Department budget and then acting shocked when you see the result. So dedicating at least 1% of the city's budget to parks would bring us closer to the funding levels of the past. But I think above all, we can all agree, I think New York City really needs a holistic vision for all of our precious open space that addresses that none of these things happen in a silo, and that would tie together a vision that would tie together parks, climate resiliency, equitable access, public health, and equitable economic development and equity as we invest in our parks with a magnifying glass on the neighborhoods, parks, and playgrounds that have been just drastically underfunded for so long. And that's my commitment as speaker. And I think the incoming members are talking about that as well. Something that we need to do. And that holistic vision, I think, would go a really long way. So thanks for having us tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Moya.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you for everyone that organized this great debate here, to my colleagues as well. Look, as you know, parks are the hidden treasures of this great city. We know that its vitality is really what we need to be making more of real investments in. If anything, what we saw was the last 18 months of COVID showed how much we need to start really investing in our parks. The 1% is critical. Eliminating the long procurement process that we face here on these projects, community input. Those are the key things that we really need to have happen as we continue to grow as a city. But if we really truly want to make the right investments here, we have to be working with an administration that's going to be coming in, having a completely different vision of the current administration right now, that is willing to make the investments, willing to baseline a lot of these programs, and listen to the communities and the neighborhoods to really provide them with the access and the economics to make our parks really thrive here in the city of New York. I know that I'm committed to doing that, and I really look forward to working with the new administration coming in, along with my colleagues as well, because it is really important. As I said, there is a very special place for everyone in our New York City parks. We all have our favorite, and we all have a great connection and a great story to that. What we need to do is not just end it there. We need to really make the right investments so that the future generations that is coming up here in New York can have similar stories and similar visions, and talk about their favorite parks and how that was able to happen because collectively we came together to make a difference. And we have that critical moment that is facing us right now coming in January. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Ms. Rivera.
Thank you so much for this forum. To everyone, I'm Carlina Rivera. I'm a lifelong New Yorker. I'm a councilwoman humbly representing District 2 in Manhattan. I'm a proud Puerto Rican woman raised by a single mother in subsidized housing. I grew up in the Lower East Side where parks and open spaces are a lifeline. And it's in these local parks and open spaces where I learned to ride my bike, where I jump rope, where I won my first softball championship. And that's what I've done to repay that, be a champion of shared open space, whether it's the 14th Street busway or making sure that new ADA accessible L train entrance on 14th Street was done on time and ahead of schedule, bringing in unprecedented funding to our parks system, funding pedestrian plazas, school open spaces, our NYCHA campuses, taking care of those potholes and those cracks that can be dangerous. And with our current realities, we have to be forward thinking. That has to include a real vision, whether that's through the work I've already done around bioswales, making open streets our reality, bringing funding to the largest shared street in the city, and even being capable of making hard choices on resiliency to best protect our city. And so we're emerging from a public health crisis that's dramatically changed the way we think about how to solve our biggest issues. And one of the most important things to come from that is we found a path to reclaiming public space for New Yorkers. It has everything to do with equity and economic and racial justice. And when we do these things together, when we engage people, when we make sure that our community is leading a lot of this work, communities are happier. And with their involvement, we have better parks and we have safer and cleaner parks because the community feels like they belong and they're invested. So I'm all in on expanding our parks and our green spaces. And as speaker, I also know that individual council members know their communities best. We cannot push a one-size-fits-all agenda when it comes to open space. And I look forward to the opportunity to work with each and every one of my colleagues on a green recovery that works for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Powers.
Thank you. First of all, I think I'm at the end. I want to say thanks to Katie Honan for holding it down and emceeing tonight. So thanks to New York Parks and everyone for putting us in the same place to talk about a vision for open space, public realm, and parks for the next few years. And I think that everybody here would agree we're at a major moment right now where we can go left or go right when it comes to how we're going to make a serious investment and how we're going to keep some of the really meaningful programs that we put in place over the last year to make sure that New Yorkers had spaces to play, to meet, and to socialize in. And not only do I think it's going to be important that we are creating new park space and creating new parks in every single council district in the next 4 years, but that we're looking at innovative ways to look at space that's normally reserved for one use and starting to convert it to spaces where we can have a place to meet, socialize, and become our own personal open spaces in each community. Whether it's open dining, open streets, waterfronts, you name it. I think what we do in the next 4 years coming out of this recovery is going to be a major opportunity, and I hope we don't miss it. It's going to include the 1% commitment here around budgets, or hopefully more, but it's also going to take political will and coordination and working with our colleagues to actually move some of those programs forward. And so I have been, I think the last 4 years, a strong supporter of many of the opportunities in my district to pedestrianize, to create open spaces, to invest in our parks. And I want to make sure every council member has that opportunity in their district as well. So thank you to everyone for being here tonight. We had a great attendance, I can tell because I see the counter, but also thanks to my colleagues who I think have been doing great work and have been very thoughtful in their own districts and communities when it comes to how to invest in open space and make sure every New Yorker has a short walk away from a really good park.
Great, thank you. And that's it. I know we're a little bit over time, but I want to thank our partner organizations, New Yorkers for Parks, the New York League of Conservation Voters, Regional Plan Association, and Center for an Urban Future. Thank you to the viewers for watching. If you missed any part of the forum, it'll be online soon. It'll be on the New Yorkers for Park website, which is ny4p.org. And that's also a place where you can learn more about how important parks and open space are as infrastructure and how you can get involved as well. So thank you to the speaker candidates, and thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Thanks. Good night, everyone.
Good night.